The Woman Born in the Walls. The sound that changed my life forever wasn't dramatic, just soft humming in the walls of my Berlin apartment. A lullaby in a language I recognized, but had never heard spoken aloud. I was 65, recently widowed, and in Germany to research my family's history for a memoir I'd promised my late husband I'd write. What I found instead was a living ghost, a woman who had never seen the sun. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 3 months after burying David in Portland, Oregon, I decided to honor his last wish. He'd always encouraged me to dig into my family's past, to understand the stories my grandmother Rose had taken to her grave. All I knew was that she'd fled Germany in 1939, leaving behind siblings who disappeared during the war. The details died with her in 1987, when I was too young to ask the right questions and too busy building my journalism career to care about ancient history. Now, staring at retirement and an empty house full of memories, those untold stories suddenly mattered. I chose Berlin deliberately, the city my grandmother had fled. Through a genealogy website, I traced the last known address of the Rosenberg family to a building in Schöneberg that had somehow survived the bombing. The current owner, Ingrid Mueller, had been surprisingly accommodating when I'd emailed asking about renting a room to research my family history. Her English was excellent, and she seemed genuinely interested in helping me connect with my past. The building was exactly what I'd expected, a 5-story pre-war structure with thick walls and high ceilings, the kind of solid German architecture built to last centuries. Ingrid, a woman in her mid-80s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes, met me at the entrance with genuine warmth. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. 2 rooms with period furniture and tall windows that filled the space with afternoon light. It was perfect for my needs, quiet, comfortable, and exactly the kind of place where I could imagine my great-grandmother Sarah Rosenberg raising her children before the world went insane. The first few days passed peacefully. I spent mornings at the German Federal Archives, afternoons at various memorial sites, and evenings transcribing documents and genealogy records. The official story was heartbreakingly familiar. The Rosenberg family had simply vanished in 1943. No deportation records, no death certificates, no forwarding addresses. They'd become statistics in a sea of statistics. But on my 4th night, lying in the unfamiliar bed and listening to the building settle around me, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Singing, soft, melodic, and coming from inside the walls. At first, I convinced myself it was a neighbor. Old buildings carry sound in strange ways, but as I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, I realized the voice was too close, too clear. It was coming from directly behind my headboard, as if someone was sitting just inches away on the other side of the plaster. The song was a lullaby in what sounded like Yiddish, a language I'd heard my grandmother hum when she thought no one was listening, though she'd always claimed not to remember any of the old words. When the singing stopped, I heard footsteps, not the heavy footfalls of someone walking on a floor above or below, but soft, careful steps moving horizontally through space that shouldn't exist. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I mentioned the sounds to Ingrid over coffee in her kitchen on the ground floor. Her reaction was immediate and troubling. Her face went pale, Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup, and she spent several long seconds staring out the window before responding. She suggested I might be hearing sounds from the neighboring building. Old Berlin apartments were built so close together that noise traveled easily between walls. Her explanation was logical, but something in her eyes told me she knew exactly what I'd heard and was desperate for me to accept a lie. That evening, I did what any journalist would do. I investigated. Using a small flashlight and the apartment key, I carefully examined every wall in my rooms. The building's original layout, according to the architectural drawings I'd found at the city planning office, showed my apartment as part of a larger space that had been divided sometime after the war. But the proportions seemed wrong. Based on the exterior dimensions and the thickness of the walls, there should have been more space. Behind my bedroom's built-in bookshelf, I found what I was looking for, a section where the wall sounded hollow when tapped. More importantly, I noticed that several books on the lower shelves had been moved recently. Dust patterns showed they'd been pulled out and replaced, but not quite in their original positions. When I removed the books, I found a small metal lever disguised as a decorative bracket. When pulled, it released a hidden panel that swung inward on well-oiled hinges. Behind it was darkness and the smell of old wood, candle wax, and something else, something lived in and human. I squeezed through the opening with my flashlight and found myself in a narrow corridor that ran parallel to my apartment wall. The space was maybe 3 feet wide and had obviously been used recently. There were candle stubs in holders along the walls, and the wooden floor showed wear patterns from decades of foot traffic. The corridor led to a small room, perhaps 8 feet square, that took my breath away. The walls were covered in artwork, intricate drawings, done in what looked like charcoal and homemade paints. Portraits of faces I didn't recognize, landscape scenes that seemed to be drawn from memory, and Hebrew letters intertwined with German words. In one corner sat a small table with a kerosene lamp, several books in German and Yiddish, and neat stacks of what appeared to be handmade paper. On the table was an open journal, the pages filled with careful handwriting in German. The date at the top of the visible page was 3 days ago. Someone was living here. Recently, currently. My hands shaking, I picked up the journal and read the entry. The American woman heard me singing last night. I was careless, lost in the memory of Mama's lullabies. Ingrid warned me to be more careful, but sometimes the loneliness becomes too heavy to bear in silence. She looks like family. Something in her eyes reminds me of the photograph Mama kept of her sister in America. But I cannot risk exposure. I have survived this long by remaining invisible. The entry was signed with a single letter, M. I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me and spun around, my heart hammering. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, small, elderly, wearing what looked like clothes from another era. In the flashlight beam, I could see wild gray hair, deeply lined skin, and eyes that held 80 years of secrets. We stared at each other in absolute silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then the woman spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. In heavily accented English, she told me I was Sarah's granddaughter. She could see her in my face. Her name was Miriam Rosenberg. She was 80 years old, and she had never been outside this building. The story she told me over the following hours Sitting in that hidden room by lamplight was unlike anything I'd ever heard as a journalist. Her mother, Rachel, had been my grandmother Sarah's younger sister. When the deportations began in 1943, the Muller family, Ingrid's grandparents, had offered to hide Rachel in the secret spaces behind their apartment walls. The building had been constructed in the 1880s with servants' corridors and hidden passages, remnants of an era when the wealthy wanted their help to be invisible. Rachel was 17, unmarried, and 3 months pregnant when she disappeared into the walls. The pregnancy was the result of rape by a Nazi officer during a raid on the Jewish quarter. Rather than face the shame and danger of bearing a German soldier's child in the camps, Rachel chose to disappear entirely. The Muller family provided food, water, and basic necessities passed through hidden panels. In return, Rachel helped with household tasks she could perform unseen, mending clothes, preparing food, even teaching the Muller children to read and write. Miriam was born in the hidden room in February 1944, delivered by Mrs. Miller with only her mother and a medical book for guidance. For the first year of her life, she existed only in whispers and shadows. After the war ended, Rachel was too traumatized to leave. The world outside had become alien and terrifying. She'd lost her entire family, had no documentation of her existence, and was paralyzed by agoraphobia that had developed during years of confinement. The Miller family, feeling responsible for their hidden guests, agreed to let them stay temporarily while Rachel recovered. Temporary became permanent. Months became years. Years became decades. Rachel taught Miriam to read and write using books the Millers provided. She shared every story she could remember about the family they'd lost, about Jewish traditions and holidays, about the world beyond the walls that Miriam would never see. When Miriam was 12, Rachel began teaching her to draw and paint, using materials smuggled in by their protectors. In 1963, when Miriam was 19, Rachel died of what was probably cancer. There had been no way to get proper medical care without revealing their existence. Miriam buried her mother in the building's basement, in a space the Muellers had secretly walled off for that purpose. For the next 60 years, Miriam lived alone in the walls. She never married, never had children, never felt sunlight on her skin, or breathed fresh air. Her entire world consisted of the hidden passages, the secret room, and the sounds of life happening just beyond her reach. She learned English by listening to radio broadcasts and television shows through the walls. She understood the modern world from fragments overheard and glimpses through cracks, but had never experienced any of it directly. The Mueller family had kept the secret through 3 generations. Ingrid's grandfather, who'd helped hide Rachel originally. Ingrid's father, who'd grown up knowing about the woman in the walls. And finally, Ingrid herself, who'd inherited not just the building, but the responsibility for its hidden resident. As Miriam spoke, I found myself crying for her lost life, for my grandmother who died never knowing her sister's fate, for the waste and tragedy of it all. But what struck me most was Miriam's intelligence and grace. Despite her isolation, she was articulate, well-read, and possessed a quiet dignity that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. She'd created an entire life within those walls. Her artwork covered every surface, hundreds of portraits drawn from memory and imagination, landscapes based on her mother's descriptions of the world outside, abstract pieces that seemed to capture emotion in pure color and form. She'd written poetry in 3 languages, composed music she'd never heard played, and maintained detailed journals documenting 8 decades of hidden existence. But she was also profoundly damaged. The idea of leaving the walls sent her into panic attacks. She'd never seen a car up close, never used modern technology, never touched another human being except her mother and occasionally Ingrid. Her skin was pale as paper from lack of sunlight, and her body showed the effects of a lifetime without proper nutrition or medical care. Yet she was alive. Against all odds, in defiance of history and common sense, she was alive. I spent the next week visiting Miriam every evening, bringing food from outside and listening to her stories. She wanted to know everything about America, about our grandmother Sarah's life there, about the family she'd never met. In return, she shared memories her mother had passed down, family recipes, holiday traditions, stories about relatives I'd never known existed. Through Miriam, I met my great-great-grandparents, learned about cousins who died in the camps, discovered family quirks and traditions that had somehow survived in hiding for 80 years. She was a living link to a past I'd thought was lost forever. But I also realized she was dying. Not from any specific illness, but from the accumulated weight of her isolation. She'd survived this long through sheer willpower and the routine of daily existence, but I could see that willpower failing. She spoke often of wanting to join her mother, of being tired of the endless sameness of her hidden life. That's when I reached out to a friend from my journalism days, someone who'd covered war crimes tribunals. Through him, I gained access to the German Federal Office of Justice archives, hoping to find documents that would help establish Miriam's identity. What I discovered made me feel sick. In a folder of war criminal photographs, I found a picture dated 1943. A group of SS officers standing outside a building in Schöneberg, the very building where I was living. And among them, in the center, stood a young man with a caption underneath, Untersturmführer Otto Müller, Deportation Administrative Division, Ingrid's grandfather. With trembling hands, I flipped through more pages. Otto Müller wasn't just any officer. He specialized in managing Jewish property. His unit was responsible for confiscating homes, businesses, personal belongings, and among the documents was a detailed description of his methods. Otto didn't just rob Jewish families. He selected young women and girls for personal use before sending them to the camps. Rachel was on his list. I returned to Ingrid with these documents, feeling everything inside me burn with rage. When I showed her the photograph of her grandfather, she didn't look surprised. She looked terrified. Ingrid collapsed into a chair, aging 10 years in a second. She told me the truth she'd been hiding for 80 years. She'd learned about her grandfather's past when she was 16, finding his diaries in the attic. Otto had bought Jewish women from other officers for money or favors. Rachel wasn't the first. For the right to remove them from deportation lines, the women officially disappeared into the camps. Unofficially, they became personal property. Ingrid's grandmother had known and helped, cooking food, cleaning up after the prisoners. After the war, when grandfather died of a heart attack in 1946, the family didn't know what to do with the traumatized, sick Rachel, who was pregnant with a second child. Miriam had an older brother, but he didn't survive, dying in infancy from illness. Rachel had buried him with her own hands in the basement. Miriam was the daughter of a war criminal. The Mueller family had kept this secret for 3 generations, living with shame and guilt every day. Each generation knew the truth, but was too frightened to change anything. They became accomplices to grandfather's crimes simply through their silence. I knew I had to tell Miriam the truth, but how? How could I explain to an 80-year-old woman that her entire life had been based on a lie? That her mother wasn't a hidden refugee but a slave? That she herself was the daughter of a man who had destroyed her people? When I showed Miriam the photograph of Otto Mueller, she recognized him immediately. This was the man from her mother's nightmares. Rachel had screamed this name in her sleep. Otto, no, please, no. I told her everything, that her mother had been a purchased slave, that Otto Mueller had been a war criminal who used Jewish women as property, that she herself was the daughter of this monster. Miriam listened in absolute silence, her face growing whiter and whiter. She slowly stood and walked to the wall where hung a portrait of her mother, the only photograph she'd drawn from memory. Now she understood why her mother had never told the truth about her father, saying only that he was a bad man and that she shouldn't think about him. Her voice was frighteningly calm when she realized she was the daughter of a killer, that her blood was tainted with evil. Then she exploded. For 80 years, she had lived in her father-murderer's house, eaten his food, breathed his air, slept in walls he had built for his victims. Miriam began tearing her drawings from the walls, screaming in Yiddish, curses her mother must have whispered in the darkness. She was destroying her life's work, understanding that Ingrid had known all these years who she was and had fed her lies. Over the next few days, Miriam refused to speak with Ingrid. She locked herself in her hidden room and refused to eat. A new entry appeared in her diary. She was the devil's daughter. Her mother had been his toy. She should never have been born or lived. Every day of her existence was an insult to her mother's memory. I realized I was losing her, not to old age or illness, but to despair. Then the situation got even worse. Representatives of the Mueller family, Otto's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, learned that their family secret might be exposed. They offered me money for silence, threatened lawsuits if I published the story. They claimed that revealing the truth would destroy their reputations, their businesses, harm their children. One of them, a well-dressed man my age, insisted that all this had happened long ago. Why dig up the past when the old man was dead? Let them rest in peace. When I asked about Miriam, he coldly replied that the truth would kill her, that I had already nearly killed her with my discoveries, and he was right. Miriam was fading before my eyes, losing the will to live with each passing day. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I gathered all the documents, all the evidence, all the photographs, and turned them over to the German federal prosecutor's office. The Mueller family tried to stop me. Threats turned to pleas to attempted bribes. But I could see Miriam dying, and I understood. The only way to save her was to give her power over her own story. The case gained publicity. The media called it the last trial of Nazism. Miriam wasn't just a victim. She was a living witness to crimes that were thought to be forgotten. But the most important thing didn't happen in court, but in the little hidden room when Miriam spoke to me for the first time in weeks. She quietly admitted that she wasn't guilty of who her father had been. but she was guilty of allowing his family to erase her mother's existence. Miriam decided to testify. At 80 years old, leaving the building for the first time in her life, she appeared before the court and told her story, not as a victim, but as a witness, as memory. Ingrid also testified, telling about the family lie, about how 3 generations had kept silent out of fear and shame. The court posthumously found Otto Mueller guilty of war crimes. His family was ordered to pay compensation to a Holocaust victims fund. But for Miriam, the most important thing was the official recognition that her mother had been a victim, not a willing accomplice. After the verdict, Miriam told me that now Mama could rest in peace. Her story had been told truthfully. Miriam lived another 3 years, not in a hidden room, but in a small apartment with windows facing east, so she could greet the sun every morning. She learned to use a computer and started a blog, telling other survivors that it's never too late to demand justice. When she died at 83, hundreds of people came to her funeral. Survivors, historians, ordinary people touched by her story. Ingrid was there too, aged and broken, but freed from the burden of the family secret. The building in Schöneberg now bears the name Rachel Rosenberg. A memorial plaque at the entrance reads, "Here lived Rachel Rosenberg, 1925 to 1963, victim of Nazi crimes. Here was born and raised her daughter, Miriam Rosenberg, 1944 to 2027, who survived to tell the truth. The hidden rooms are preserved as a museum, but now they tell the complete story, not only about the heroism of those who saved, but about the complexity, pain, and sorrow, and moral ambiguity of survival. I returned to Portland, but my life was inextricably linked to Berlin. Every year I come on Miriam's birthday and lay flowers at the memorial plaque. Every year I remember the woman who taught me that truth is always more complex than we want to believe, but without it, healing is impossible. Miriam Rosenberg was born in the walls of her father-murderer's house, but she died as a free woman who turned her pain into strength, her story into a warning, and her life into proof that justice is possible, even when it seems too late. Sometimes truth kills, but sometimes it's the only thing that can give life meaning.